Hey everyone, welcome back to the Horror Stories. I know a lot of you enjoy these videos to relax before falling into a deep sleep. So before that moment arrives, leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really gives me the motivation to bring you more chilling stories. Now, settle in, relax, and let's begin tonight's eerie tale. My childhood passed in darkness, a gloomy and mysterious childhood. The Black Dragon town where I lived often experienced power outages, and when night fell, the fragile oil lamps flickered like the eyes of souls watching over me. I often played with my friends in the empty lot, sweat soaking my forehead, until my mother's sharp call echoed, "Dong Tu, go to sleep." Every time I heard my mother call, I felt both happiness and a creeping sadness. Returning home, everything was pitch black, illuminated only by the feeble oil lamp fighting off the invading mosquitoes in darkness. My family had extinguished the lights early, primarily to save oil. In that darkness, my imagination began to soar. I lay there, surrounded by shadows, thoughts swirling that made it hard to sleep. The late-night stillness felt heavy and uncomfortable. Images lingered in my mind, evoking faces I had never met. It felt as if there were a fragile thread connecting me to those in the pictures, but that thread was too delicate to grasp. The next morning, I decided to return to the trunk. I found more photographs, some even more faded and aged. I felt as if I were discovering another world, where time held no meaning. My mother saw me rummaging and asked, "What are you doing?" I pointed to the photos and said, "I want to know more about them." She sighed, a look of sadness on her face. "They have all passed on, my child. Perhaps sometimes it's better not to know." But I couldn't quell my curiosity. I asked about the hazy memories I couldn't grasp, and my mother merely shook her head, as if not wanting to stir up old stories. In the following days, I often gazed into the trunk, immersed in the old photographs. Then one night, as the oil lamp flickered, the image of my aunt resurfaced in my mind. She was not just a stranger. It felt as if I had seen her somewhere before. Had I encountered her in a dream? Dreams filled with memories I couldn't explain. I began to feel strange sensations each time darkness enveloped me. There were subtle noises around that made me feel like someone was watching me. I heard whispers, as if someone was calling my name from the shadows. The intertwining fear and curiosity left me restless. One night, late into the evening, I decided to step outside for a bit of light. I walked to the lot where we used to play. The moon shone brightly, but the surroundings remained eerily silent. Suddenly I heard footsteps, soft sounds drifting by like a breeze. I stopped, my heart racing. "Dong Tu!" I heard a whisper, but couldn't pinpoint its source. I turned, looked around, but only saw the trees swaying in the wind. Was it just my imagination? Or was there truly something here in the night? I decided to head back, but as I turned, a fleeting image crossed my mind. An elderly woman with sorrowful eyes, seemingly standing in the distance, in the dark. I shook my head, telling myself I was just dreaming. But as I walked away, the feeling that she was still watching me wouldn't fade. The next day, I sought out my mother again, asking about the memories I couldn't touch. She looked at me with worry, then said, "You shouldn't dwell too much on the past. Live your life." I nodded, but unease lingered in my heart. There was something unresolved, and I felt as if some force was pulling me toward the mysteries. One evening, I decided to challenge myself. I lit the oil lamp, placed it in the center of the room, and sat down beside the trunk. I would learn more about the people in the photos, uncover the connections between us. As I flipped through each picture, I suddenly realized that the ant in the photo was like a bridge, leading me back to untold memories. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through, extinguishing the oil lamp, leaving me in darkness. I took a deep breath, feeling the surrounding silence, but couldn't shake off the fear in my heart. I sensed something approaching, and perhaps tonight I would uncover the hidden truth within the deep shadows of memory. Lying in the darkened room, I quietly listened to the sounds around me. The chickens in the coop were restless, occasionally murmuring indistinctly. Then one night, when I was just 7 years old, I discovered an old trunk in the house. Inside were faded photographs. I lit the oil lamp, its weak light filling the air with the smell of oil. The black and white photos had yellowed, and the people within were unfamiliar. In one photograph, an old man sat stiffly, his face expressionless. My mother pointed at him. "This is your grandfather." I looked up and asked, "Why don't I remember him?" My mother pondered, then my father spoke. "That's your paternal grandfather." I continued to flip through the pictures, and my mother pointed to another one. "This is your maternal grandfather and grandmother." They, too, wore dark clothing, their stern expressions making me feel as if they were reproaching something. When I inquired about another photo, my mother said, "That's your great-aunt." But I felt a strange familiarity with the woman. The image of the old lady who had once given me an ice cream at the cooperative store flashed through my mind. It had rained that day, and no one had come to buy anything, but it wasn't her. As Ted approached, when the crowd pulled the boat ashore and the drums echoed, I squeezed into the crowd and accidentally bumped into an elderly woman. She turned, her gaze piercing, as if seeing through my soul. I fell ill, and during a midnight trip to the health station, I saw an elderly woman lying on a hospital bed, her eyes filled with despair. But it wasn't her. I struggled to remember, but I still couldn't. It must have been a very distant memory, a fleeting moment that passed through my short life. "Where's my aunt now?" I asked my mother. "She passed away long ago," my mother replied. "But I met her." My mother paused, then asked, "Where did you meet her?" I shook my head, unable to recall. My mother looked at my father and then back at me, finally saying, "Children shouldn't speak nonsense." That night, I lay listening to my parents' whispered conversations, feeling as if I was not only lying in darkness, but also amidst unsolved secrets. In this way, that darkness nurtured not just my imagination, but also stirred up hazy memories, souls that had never truly left. The darkness enveloped me like a thick blanket, and I sat there, feeling as if I were in another world. My heart raced, as if waiting for something. I reached out, searching for light, but only touched the cold air. In that silence, I heard the whisper once more. "Dong Tu." The voice was gentle, like a passing breeze, yet clear. I suddenly felt a shiver run down my spine. My breath quickened. Someone was calling me. I wanted to stand up, but my legs felt frozen. I sat still, trying to listen to that call. It was not just a sound, it carried pain, regret from a distant past. Finally, I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and called, "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed, filled with both anxiety and anticipation. No one answered. Instead, I felt a sudden cold breeze sweep by, as if guiding me. Suddenly, the pale light from the oil lamp beside me flared up. I opened my eyes, and in that dim light, I saw the figure of an elderly woman standing before me. Her face was hazy, but her eyes shone brightly, as if a fire burned within them. I blinked, unable to believe what I was seeing. "You have found me," the old woman said, her voice gentle yet strong. "Dong Tu, you have called my name for a long time." I didn't know how to react. "Who are you?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The old woman looked at me, her gaze filled with understanding and sorrow. "I am your aunt," she replied. "You do not remember, but I have been by your side in the most important moments of your life. The photographs you saw contain my memories." I felt a surge of emotions that were both familiar and foreign. "Why are you here? Why can I see you?" I asked, curious. "Because you yearn to understand your roots," the old woman said. "But memories are like ghosts. We cannot easily let go. There are things you need to know, stories yet to be told." The old woman began to recount her life, the years that passed in Black Dragon Town. I listened intently, her words flowing like a river of the past, bringing me back to the hazy memories I had sought. There were pains, sacrifices, and lost joys over the years. "You are not alone," she said, her gaze piercing through to my heart. "We all have invisible connections to our ancestors, to those who have departed. They live within us, in the memories you cherish." The old woman pulled me into a gentle embrace, and I felt her warmth transfer to me. "Aunt, why don't I remember you?" I asked, tears welling up. "Sometimes you must forget to move forward," she replied. "But now you have grown stronger. You have the power to face the past and uncover the truth." Suddenly, the light from the oil lamp flickered again, and I felt her form begin to fade. "Aunt," I called out, filled with worry. "Don't go." My name is Jack, and when I was a child, I had a friend named Ethan. It wasn't until I grew up that I realized the truth behind the strange events that unfolded during that time. and that my parents had always known something they hadn't shared with me. It all began when I turned 10. My parents had moved us to a small remote village called Maple Creek, nestled in the countryside of Oregon. My father had just secured a new job there, and though the village was quiet and far from any big city, he didn't want us to be apart, so he bought a modest house on the edge of town. We moved in just a few days before my birthday. Our family was always close. Even though I was already 10, my father would still insist on helping me with simple things like running a bath or tucking me in at night. My mother, too, was always gentle and caring, the kind of mother who made me feel like nothing bad could ever happen as long as she was around. On the day of my birthday, after the small family celebration ended, I decided to explore the new neighborhood. As I walked around, I came across a peculiar sight. A woman in her late 30s was leaning against a rusty broken fence, attaching a piece of it to an old, abandoned house that sat at the end of the lane. The house looked completely run down, with its windows boarded up and its paint peeling away. Curious, I approached her and asked, "Why are you attaching your fence to the old house? Doesn't it belong to someone else?" The woman looked at me for a moment, her eyes sharp but kind, and she replied in a soft voice, "Just trying to protect your family, dear. Don't worry about it." I was confused by her answer. "But my family's fine. Who would bother us?" She smiled faintly, almost as if she knew something I didn't. "Sometimes it's not about who's alive, but about who's not," she said before turning back to her work and disappearing into her house. That night I was woken up by a strange noise, a soft thud sound, like someone rummaging through our things downstairs. Half asleep, I got out of bed and crept halfway down the stairs, calling out, "Mom, Dad, are you looking for something?" No response. The house was eerily quiet, the only light coming from the street lamp outside that barely filtered through the curtains. Our new home didn't have much in the way of electricity. Most of the village was still reliant on old-fashioned kerosene lamps or candles. I grabbed a candle from the hallway and lit it, holding it up as I cautiously made my way downstairs. As I reached the living room, the dim glow of the candle flickered, casting long shadows across the room. And that's when I saw him, a boy about my age, sitting at the dining table, stuffing pieces of bread into his mouth as if he hadn't eaten in days. I froze. The boy looked up, his wide eyes startled by the candlelight. He was dirty, his clothes tattered and covered in dust. For a moment, he seemed terrified, like he didn't belong there, and was afraid I would call for help. Instead, I slowly put the candle down on the table and whispered, "It's okay, you don't have to be scared." The boy didn't say a word, but he didn't run either. I stepped closer, noticing how pale and fragile he looked, like someone who had been lost for a long time. I felt sorry for him. His face was smeared with dirt, and out of some strange impulse, I reached out to wipe it away. As I did, the boy's features became clearer, and I suddenly remembered where I had seen him before. Earlier that day, just before I had spoken to the woman fixing her fence, I had caught a glimpse of this boy sitting on the porch of that same abandoned house. I hadn't paid him much attention then, but now, standing in front of me, he looked almost ghostly. Before I could say anything more, my father came down the stairs, his footsteps heavy and concerned. I instinctively stepped in front of the boy, trying to hide him. "I heard something down here. Is everything all right?" my dad asked, his voice low. "Yeah, Dad, I thought I heard you or Mom, but it was nothing. I'm fine," I quickly replied. My father looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "All right, son, go back to bed, okay? It's late." I glanced over my shoulder, but the boy was gone. Just like that, he had vanished without a trace. My father hadn't seen him. When I returned to my room, I found the boy sitting by the window, staring out at the empty street. I sat next to him and asked, "What's your name?" He hesitated for a moment before quietly answering, "Ethan." I smiled, trying to ease the tension. "I'm Jack. You don't have to be scared. You can stay here if you need to." Ethan looked at me with a sadness I couldn't quite understand. "My family's gone," he whispered. "They died in an accident, and I don't have anywhere else to go." We stayed up that night, talking quietly in the dark. Ethan told me how his family had died when a truck slid off the icy road and crashed into their car. The accident had happened on a rainy night, and since then he had been wandering around the village, not sure where he belonged. At some point during our conversation, I asked him, "Why are you living in that old house? It looks abandoned." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes. "That was my house," he said, his voice trembling. "It's where my family lived before the accident." I didn't know what to say. I felt a deep sense of sorrow for Ethan, but I also felt protective of him. I told him he could stay with me, that I would hide him from my parents. Ethan smiled for the first time that night, a faint, grateful smile, and nodded, the sound of secrets. For the next few nights, Ethan would come to my room after everyone had gone to bed, and we'd talk. But strange things started happening. Every night, without fail, I'd hear the same thud noise, like someone searching for something in the dark. My father, who was normally so alert, never seemed to hear it. One night, after another round of soft whispers and unexplained footsteps, I asked Ethan, "Do you hear those noises too?" Ethan looked at me with a solemn expression. "They're looking for me." I didn't understand. "Who's looking for you?" He sighed, his eyes dark and distant. "They come from the other side, the place where my family is. They're trying to bring me back." That night, the noise grew louder, more insistent. I could hear whispers in the hallways, voices I didn't recognize, calling out Ethan's name. I was terrified, but Ethan seemed calm, almost as if he had been expecting it. I wanted to protect him, to keep him safe, but the longer he stayed, the more the sounds grew, like an invisible force was closing in on him. The final goodbye one evening, after days of sleepless nights and strange happenings, Ethan came to me with a sad smile on his face. "I have to go now," he said quietly. I was confused. "Where? Where are you going?" He looked out the window, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "I don't belong here anymore. I'm not supposed to stay." I didn't understand what he meant, but deep down, I knew this was goodbye. I hugged him tightly, not wanting to let him go, but Ethan simply whispered, "Thank you, Jack. You've been a good friend." And then, as quietly as he had appeared in my life, Ethan was gone. I never saw him again after that night, but the noises, the whispers and the thuds, finally stopped. The house grew quiet and the air felt lighter, as if a presence had lifted. A haunting memory. Years later, when I was old enough to piece things together, I asked my parents about Ethan. They looked at me with startled expressions, like they had been holding on to a secret for too long. My father finally explained that the village had long been rumored to be haunted, especially the old house at the end of the lane. "A boy named Ethan used to live there," my mother said softly. "But his family died in a car accident. He was the only one who survived, but he disappeared shortly after. No one ever found out what happened to him." I sat there in silence, the weight of the truth settling over me. Ethan had never been alive when I met him. He had been a ghost, lost and lonely, trapped between two worlds. Years passed after my encounter with Ethan, but the memory of him never left me. Even as I grew older, moved away from Maple Creek, and started a new life in the bustling city, I couldn't shake the feeling that our brief friendship had left a permanent mark on me. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, still expecting to hear those soft footsteps or the distant whispers echoing through the old house. But life moved on, and I buried the memories deep, convincing myself that what happened was just a strange part of childhood. However, the past has a way of catching up to you when you least expect it, an unexpected return. It wasn't until I received a call from my father years later that I found myself drawn back to Maple Creek. He called on a cold November evening, his voice quiet and unsteady. He told me that my mother had passed away suddenly. The news hit me hard. Though I hadn't visited home much in recent years, the thought of returning without my mother being there felt impossible. Still, I knew I had to go back. When I arrived in Maple Creek for the funeral, the village was exactly how I remembered it, quiet, remote, and strangely unsettling. The roads were still lined with trees that cast long shadows over the ground, and the houses stood like silent witnesses to the passage of time. My childhood home hadn't changed much either, though it felt emptier, colder without my mother's presence. After the funeral, I stayed with my father for a few days, helping him sort through old belongings and keeping him company in the now too quiet house. It was during this time that I found myself drawn back to that old abandoned house at the end of the lane, the one where I had met Ethan all those years ago. Revisiting the past one evening, unable to sleep, I bundled up and decided to take a walk. The air was crisp, and the sky was dark, only the faintest sliver of moonlight illuminating the path ahead. My feet seemed to move on their own, carrying me down the familiar lane toward the house that had haunted my childhood. It was still there, though now it looked even more dilapidated than before. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged as if the whole structure might collapse at any moment. The fence that had once separated the property from the road had long since fallen apart, leaving the house exposed and vulnerable to the elements. As I approached, I felt a strange pull, a sense of unfinished business. The memories of Ethan came flooding back, and with them, the unanswered questions. What had really happened to him? Was he truly a ghost? And why had he appeared to me, of all people? I stood in front of the house, staring at the broken front door which hung off its hinges, creaking in the wind. For a moment I considered leaving, but something inside me wouldn't let me turn away. I had to know. A familiar presence. Stepping inside, the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and the air was thick with dust and decay. The house was exactly as I remembered it, a shell of a home, cold and lifeless. I wandered through the empty rooms, each one filled with shadows and the faint scent of mildew. As I made my way upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a sensation I hadn't felt in years, a prickling at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The house was silent, but the silence itself felt heavy. I entered the room where I had first seen Ethan all those years ago. It was exactly as I remembered, dark and barren, with only the faintest trace of moonlight filtering in through the broken window. But there was something else, too, a faint whisper. "Jack," I froze. The voice was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was Ethan. "Ethan?" I whispered, my heart racing. The air seemed to shift, and suddenly, there he was, standing in the corner of the room, just as he had appeared all those years ago. He looked the same, pale, with those sad eyes and dusty clothes, but there was something different about him this time. He seemed tired, faded. "I've been waiting," he said, his voice hollow. I took a step closer, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. "Waiting for what? Why are you still here?" Ethan's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of emotion. Regret, sorrow, something deeper that I couldn't quite place. "I never left," he said quietly. "I couldn't." The sound of regret. As we stood there in the dim light, Ethan began to tell me the truth about why he had stayed behind, trapped in that old house. He explained that after his family had died in the accident, he hadn't been able to move on. His spirit had lingered, tied to the house, waiting for someone to help him find peace. When I had met him all those years ago, he had hoped that I could be the one to help him, but he hadn't been ready. Not yet. Now he was. "I can't stay here any longer," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "But I need you to do something for me." I nodded, unsure of what he was about to ask. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, then looked toward the broken window. "There's a box, buried under the tree in the backyard. It's all I have left of my family. I need you to find it and bring it to me. It's the only way I can leave." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I nodded. "I'll find it." Without another word, I left the house and made my way into the backyard. The tree Ethan had mentioned was still there, its gnarled branches reaching up toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Beneath it, the ground was soft, as though it had been disturbed recently. I knelt down and began digging with my hands, the cold earth giving way easily. After what felt like hours, my fingers brushed against something solid. I pulled it free from the dirt, a small wooden box, worn and weathered by time. My heart raced as I stood, holding the box tightly in my hands. I returned to the house, where Ethan was waiting. His eyes lit up when he saw the box, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I handed him the box, and as he took it, something remarkable happened. The air around him seemed to shimmer, and for the first time, he looked at peace. The tiredness in his eyes faded, and the sadness that had always clung to him like a shadow began to lift. Ethan looked at me one last time, his expression filled with gratitude. "I'm free now," he said softly. Thanks to you. And then, just like that, he was gone. The room was empty, and the house felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from its very foundation. Closure at last. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where Ethan had been, trying to process everything that had just happened. In my hands, I still held the wooden box. Slowly, I opened it, revealing its contents: an old photograph of Ethan and his family, a small toy car, and a letter addressed to him, written in a child's handwriting. It was a farewell letter, written by Ethan's little sister the night before the accident. She had slipped it into his backpack before they left for their fateful trip, hoping he'd find it later. Tears welled up in my eyes as I read the letter, feeling the weight of the sorrow that had kept Ethan bound to that house for so long. But now, at last, he was free. The next morning, I left Maple Creek for good. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time at the old house at the end of the lane. It looked the same as it always had, worn and forgotten. But now, it no longer felt haunted. Ethan was finally at peace, and so was I. And though I'll never forget him, I know that wherever he is now, he's no longer trapped between two worlds. He's finally home. When Hoa was just a little girl, her family lived in a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Their next-door neighbor was Mrs. Lamb, an elderly woman who, despite her age, was always warm and welcoming. Mrs. Lamb had a kind heart, often bringing food over to Hoa's family, a gesture of friendship that her parents deeply appreciated. The smells from Mrs. Lamb's kitchen were a mix of fresh herbs and the rich scent of homemade meals, but there was always something slightly off. Mrs. Lamb's house also carried with it the faint odor of fish and raw meat, a reminder of her occupation as a fishmonger and butcher. Even as a child, Hoa was fond of Mrs. Lamb. The old woman would visit often, playing games with Hoa and treating her to stories from her youth. Hoa never minded the lingering smell of meat and fish that clung to Mrs. Lamb's clothes. It became a background noise, blending into the daily rhythm of their lives. But there was something else, something that neither Hoa nor her family could quite explain. Every so often, from the direction of Mrs. Lamb's house, they'd hear strange noises, faint cries for help, though the source could never be located. The cries were distant, like echoes bouncing off unseen walls, and they haunted Hoa's childhood memories. As the years passed, Hoa grew accustomed to these eerie sounds, dismissing them as part of the strange mysteries that surrounded Mrs. Lamb's home. Despite the oddities, she had only good memories of the old woman, at least until the day when everything changed, a day that changed everything. It was the summer Hoa turned 5. One afternoon, as Mrs. Lamb sat in the living room playing with her, Hoa's mother and father came into the room. The moment they entered, her mother paused, her face twisting in disgust. "What's that smell?" her mother asked, looking around. "Hoa, have you not bathed today?" Hoa, surprised by the accusation, looked up and said, "I did! I'm clean!" Her mother glanced at Mrs. Lamb, her expression shifting into something unreadable, part anger, part confusion. "This smell," she muttered, her eyes narrowing toward the old woman. Without thinking, Hoa blurted, "It's probably because of the dead rat in my room. I found one there a few days ago, but it's gone now." Her mother seemed to accept this explanation, though reluctantly. She shot one last suspicious glance at Mrs. Lamb before retreating to her bedroom. The next morning, as Hoa and her father sat at the kitchen table, her father asked, "Did your mother sleep in your room last night?" "No," Hoa replied, frowning. "Didn't she come to bed with you?" Her father hesitated, the confusion in his eyes mirroring Hoa's own. "She didn't come to our room." Concern quickly overtook the confusion. They searched the house from top to bottom, but her mother was nowhere to be found. The neighbors were questioned, but none had seen her. Desperation grew, and soon only one house remained unasked: Mrs. Lamb's. Hoa and her father hurried next door, hearts pounding as they knocked on Mrs. Lamb's door. When the old woman answered, she seemed calm, even a bit surprised to see them. "Have you seen my mother?" Hoa asked. "She didn't come home last night." Mrs. Lamb shook her head, her voice gentle. "No, dear, I haven't seen her." But as Hoa stood there on Mrs. Lamb's front steps, something strange caught her eye. Mrs. Lamb's porch had always had 3 steps leading to her front door, but today there were 4. Hoa stared at the extra step, her mind racing. Did you build another step? She asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Lamb smiled, her eyes twinkling. Yes, I did. It helps me get inside a little easier. Hoa's father was eager to leave, but Hoa hesitated. Can I come in and sit down for a minute? She asked. Mrs. Lamb nodded, opening the door wider. Of course, dear. The stairs of whispers. As Hoa lifted her foot to step onto the first stair, a soft sound reached her ears, a child's cry. The voice was faint but unmistakable, as if it belonged to a child no older than 3. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. A wave of unease washed over her, but she tried to shake it off. The second stair creaked beneath her foot. This time the cry was replaced by the voice of a man, low and urgent. Don't, he whispered, as though pleading with her. Hoa's heart pounded, but she couldn't make sense of the warning. On the third step, another voice rang out, this time that of a woman. Run! Call the police! She urged, her tone panicked. Hoa's palms grew clammy as confusion gripped her. Just then, Mrs. Lamb's voice broke through the haze. I've got some snacks for you, Hoa, she said cheerfully from inside. Come on in. Hoa hesitated, caught between the strangeness of the voices she'd heard and Mrs. Lamb's friendly demeanor. She nodded slowly, her foot hovering over the fourth step. As soon as her foot touched the last stair, a loud, familiar voice rang out, clear and desperate. Run! Get out of there, Hoa! It was her mother's voice. Her heart stopped as her mother's next words echoed through her mind. If you go inside, you'll never come out again. A chill ran down Hoa's spine. Mrs. Lamb called from inside the house once more, her voice syrupy sweet. Come in, dear, it's safe. Hoa glanced at the door, torn between her curiosity and the overpowering sense of dread that now filled her. I'm not hungry anymore, she stammered, taking a step back. I should go home. Mrs. Lamb's smile faltered ever so slightly, but she nodded. All right, dear. Take care. The unanswered questions. After that day, Hoa never set foot in Mrs. Lamb's house again. She avoided the old woman as much as possible, coming up with excuses whenever Mrs. Lamb tried to visit. Her parents never seemed to notice the change, but Hoa couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible lurked just beneath the surface of her childhood memories. Years passed after that strange encounter with Mrs. Lamb, but the memories of the 4 steps outside her house never faded from Hoa's mind. Even as she grew older, married, and moved away from her childhood home, the echoes of those voices still haunted her dreams. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing her mother's desperate voice calling for her to run, as clear as the day it had happened. Despite this, Hoa never told anyone about the strange occurrences from her childhood. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because deep down, she wasn't certain if anyone would believe her. Or perhaps it was because a part of her wanted to leave that mystery in the past, buried like an old ghost story that had overstayed its welcome in her life. However, the past has a way of creeping back into the present, especially when questions remain unanswered. The call home, one rainy afternoon, nearly 2 decades after she had left the neighborhood, Hoa received an unexpected phone call from her father. His voice, usually warm and calm, was laced with an unusual tension. Hoa, he began, I'm not sure how to say this, but Mrs. Lamb passed away last week. Hoa felt a jolt of surprise. Mrs. Lamb had always seemed so old, yet so resilient. It was hard to imagine her not being there, standing on her porch with her welcoming smile and the faint smell of fish on her clothes. There's something else, her father continued after a pause. The police are asking questions. They found something. What do you mean? Hoa asked, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. There's been an investigation. It started after they began renovating Mrs. Lamb's house, her father explained. They found human remains, Hoa. Her father's words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Whose remains? She whispered, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to know the answer. They're still investigating, he said softly. But Hoa, the remains were found buried beneath the stairs outside her house, and some of the bones, they believe they've been there for decades. Hoa's head swam as her father's voice faded in and out. She could barely focus on his words. Her thoughts raced back to that day, to the strange voices she had heard on the steps, the extra stair that had appeared out of nowhere, and her mother's warning to run. Could it be possible? Could those voices, those cries for help, have been more than just figments of her imagination? returning to the old neighborhood. The following weekend, Hoa made the decision to return to her childhood home. The investigation into Mrs. Lamb's house had become the talk of the town. Rumors circulated about what the police had discovered, but no one had any concrete answers yet. Some speculated that Mrs. Lamb had been involved in something sinister for years, while others believed the remains might belong to victims of old crimes that had nothing to do with her. But Hoa needed to know the truth. She needed closure. As Hoa pulled up to her old neighborhood, the familiar sights of her childhood flooded back to her. The trees that lined the street, now taller and older, the cracked sidewalks she used to ride her bike on, and of course, the house she had once called home. But her eyes were drawn immediately to Mrs. Lamb's house. It looked exactly the same, except now it was cordoned off by police tape, its windows dark and foreboding. The steps that had once led to Mrs. Lamb's door still stood, though the extra stair, the mysterious fourth step, was now gone, demolished during the investigation. Hoa stood at the edge of the property, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to get too close, but something compelled her to step forward, to walk toward the house she had feared and avoided for so many years. Just as she was about to cross the boundary of the police tape, a voice startled her. "Hoa?" She turned to see an officer standing nearby, his expression a mix of curiosity and recognition. "I'm Officer Tran. I knew your mother," he said softly, stepping toward her. "She used to talk about you all the time when I'd see her around the neighborhood." Hoa nodded, still trying to process the moment. "I didn't know her well enough," she admitted, her voice quiet. "Not before she disappeared." Officer Tran's face softened with sympathy. "I remember that. It was a long time ago. There were never any leads, no signs of where she might have gone. I know it's something the whole neighborhood always wondered about." There was a pause before Officer Tran spoke again, this time in a more cautious tone. "I'm not supposed to share details from the investigation, but since you're Mrs. Lamb's old neighbor, I think you should know. Some of the bones we found, they belong to a woman who had been missing for a long time." Ho's blood ran cold. "A woman?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Tran nodded. "We don't have all the answers yet, but we're running tests. We'll know soon if it's connected to any missing persons cases." Hoa's hands began to shake. She had always feared the worst about her mother's disappearance. But now, standing on the threshold of Mrs. Lamb's dark secrets, the possibility that her mother had been one of the voices she had heard on those steps, that her mother had been buried there all along, was too terrifying to fully grasp. The truth unfolds, days turned into weeks as the investigation unfolded. Hoa stayed in touch with Officer Tran, each phone call bringing more unsettling news. The tests on the remains confirmed Hoa's deepest fears. One of the skeletons found beneath Mrs. Lamb's house belonged to her mother. The discovery shattered Hoa's world. The woman she had loved, the mother who had vanished without a trace, had been so close all those years. She had lived, perhaps for a time, right next door, and yet no one had known. No one had heard her cries for help, except perhaps Hoa herself, on those fateful steps. But Mrs. Lamb wasn't the only secret buried under her house. As the investigation deepened, more remains were uncovered. The cries Hoa had heard on the steps were no figment of her imagination. The child's voice, the man's plea, the woman's desperate warning, they were all real. They belonged to the ghosts of those who had perished at the hands of Mrs. Lamb. Over the years, it was revealed that Mrs. Lamb had lured people into her home, neighbors, drifters, even children, under the guise of her sweet grandmotherly persona. What happened inside her house remained a mystery, but none of her victims had ever left. As Hoa stood at her mother's grave, now properly marked with her name, she reflected on the strange, twisted path her life had taken. She had always wondered why Mrs. Lamb had been so kind to her, why she had brought food and played games with her as a child. Perhaps, in her own twisted way, Mrs. Lamb had spared her, had chosen to befriend her instead of turning her into another voice in the stairs. The old house was demolished not long after the remains were uncovered. But even as it crumbled, the questions and horrors it had harbored for so many years would never be fully erased from the minds of those who had lived nearby. And as for Hoa, though she had finally found answers, they brought little comfort. The house may have been destroyed, but the ghosts of Mrs. Lamb's victims would forever linger in her memory, whispering their cries for help on the wind, their voices as real to her as the day she had first heard them. My name is Lucas Adams, and for the past 5 years I've been trapped in an inescapable time loop. I'm a taxi driver by profession, but nothing about my life has been ordinary since that fateful night. Although my memories of how it all started are hazy, I remember one event vividly, a rainy evening that changed my life forever. It all began on an autumn night. The rain poured down relentlessly, drumming against my windshield as I drove through the dimly lit streets of New Haven. I was on my way to pick up a customer when I saw her. A woman stood alone in the middle of the road, completely still, drenched by the downpour. She wore a long, flowing white dress, her jet black hair plastered to her pale skin. Something about her presence felt off. Concerned, I slowed down, rolled down my window, and politely asked, "Ma'am, do you need a taxi?" She turned her head slowly and locked eyes with me. Her gaze was piercing, cold, and emotionless. Then, in a voice that sent shivers down my spine, she said, "Save him, or you'll never escape." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the misty darkness of the night. I sat there, stunned and confused. Save who? I thought. But I shook it off, convincing myself that she was just some troubled woman. There were plenty of strange people out at night in a city like this. I decided to let it go and continued on my route. The clock on the dashboard read 7:15 p.m. Moments later, a young man, no older than 25, came running up to my car, his suit soaked through by the rain. His hands trembled as he opened the door and said urgently, "Please, take me to the hospital. It's an emergency." His desperation was palpable, so I didn't hesitate. I sped toward the nearest hospital, weaving through traffic. He remained silent the entire ride, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, lost in thought. When we arrived, he bolted out of the car and disappeared into the hospital. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange unease, but I couldn't place why. As I was about to pull away, I noticed a piece of paper on the passenger seat, crumpled and wet. I assumed the young man had dropped it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded it. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the scribbled words, "Save him now." The writing was barely legible, scrawled in what looked like a hurry. Panic surged through me as the words from the mysterious woman echoed in my mind. "Save him, or you'll never escape." My pulse quickened. What was happening? Who was I supposed to save? I rushed back into the hospital, determined to find the young man. But when I reached the front desk, the receptionist looked at me with sorrowful eyes. "I'm sorry to inform you," she said softly. "The young man you brought in, he didn't make it. He passed away just moments ago." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But how?" I stammered. "He was alive just minutes ago. He was fine." The receptionist just shook her head, offering no explanation. I left the hospital, dazed and confused. On the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I sat down with my wife, Emma, for dinner. I didn't have much of an appetite, but I tried to distract myself with small talk. On the table were a fried fish and a plate of stir-fried spinach. The simple meal seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't recall why. As we ate in silence, I couldn't get the image of the young man out of my head. How could he have died so suddenly? And what did that woman mean when she said I had to save him? The next morning, I woke up feeling a sense of déjà vu. My routine was the same. Get dressed, grab my keys, head to the taxi. But something felt off. The people I picked up that day, every single one of them, looked eerily familiar. Their faces, their destinations, it was as if I had driven them all before. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. As the day progressed, I couldn't shake the growing feeling of repetition. By 7 p.m., the rain had returned, just as it had the previous night. And then, like clockwork, there she was again. The same woman in the white dress, standing in the middle of the road. I stopped the car, heart racing. This couldn't be happening. Was I dreaming? I stepped out of the car, the rain soaking through my jacket as I approached her. "Do you need a taxi?" I asked, but my voice trembled, already knowing what she would say. "Save him, or you'll never escape," she repeated, her eyes unblinking, her voice as cold as the rain pouring down around us. and just like before, she vanished into the night. I glanced at my car's clock, 7:15 p.m. Panic gripped me as I realized what was happening. The young man would show up next. Sure enough, moments later, he appeared, drenched and desperate, begging me to take him to the hospital. I was stuck in a loop. I drove him there again, knowing full well what was about to happen. After dropping him off, I found the same note on the seat, "Save him now." This time, I didn't go inside the hospital. Instead, I drove home, paralyzed by fear and confusion. At dinner, the same meal was waiting, fried fish and stir-fried spinach. It was identical to the night before. I stared at my wife, and for a brief moment I thought about telling her what was happening, but how could I explain something so bizarre? Instead, I kept quiet, trying to make sense of the pattern. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The loop continued, over and over again. Each day played out the same. The woman in white, the young man, the note, the tragic news at the hospital, and the same dinner at home. No matter what I did, I couldn't break free. By the 100th cycle, I was losing hope. I had tried everything, different routes, warning the young man, even refusing to drive him, but nothing worked. Time would always reset, dragging me back to that rainy night, 7 p.m. sharp, with the woman in white. One day, after another failed attempt, I found myself sitting in my taxi, drenched and defeated. That's when it hit me. The young man in the suit, he looked familiar, not just because of the loop, but because he reminded me of someone I used to know, someone from my past. High school. My best friend, Ethan. The realization hit me like a freight train. Ethan had been my closest friend until we drifted apart after graduation. I hadn't thought about him in years, but the resemblance was uncanny. Could it be him? The next time the loop began, I asked the young man his name. He hesitated before answering, "Ethan." My heart sank. This wasn't just some stranger. I was reliving the moment Ethan had returned to my life. As the loop continued, I pieced together the truth. Ethan was dying, and he had come to me for help. Years ago, I had been diagnosed with a severe heart condition, one that would eventually require a transplant. I had forgotten all about it in the haze of time and routine, but now I remembered. Ethan had come to offer me his heart, quite literally. The woman in white, the mysterious figure I kept encountering, wasn't warning me to save Ethan. She was telling me to save myself. The only way I could break the loop was to accept Ethan's heart. I had been too blind to see it before. The next time the clock struck 7:15, I knew what I had to do. I drove Ethan to the hospital, but this time, I didn't fight fate. I let it happen. When the doctor told me that Ethan had passed, I understood. The loop wasn't about him, it was about me. When I returned home that night, the cycle had broken. Emma greeted me with the usual dinner, but this time, the air felt different. Lighter, somehow. I knew what had changed, and for the first time in years, I felt free. But the question lingered. How had my wife known about the loop? How had she known what was needed to break it? As I looked across the table at her, a cold realization dawned on me. Emma had known all along. Somehow, she had been part of the cycle, guiding me toward the inevitable conclusion. Had she remembered every loop? Had she seen Ethan's sacrifice before I had? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I could only wonder how much she had kept from me and why. The rain had finally stopped, but the heavy weight of unanswered questions pressed down on me like a fog. I glanced across the dinner table at Emma. She sat there, calm, quietly eating, as if nothing had changed. But I knew something had. The cycle had broken. There was no repeating day, no endless loop of horror. Yet the silence between us felt louder than ever. I couldn't hold back any longer. "Emma," I began, my voice cracking, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her plate, her expression unreadable. "How long have you known?" I asked, my eyes searching hers for any flicker of emotion, any sign of recognition. "How long have you known about the loop? About Ethan? About everything?" She paused, fork suspended midair, and for a moment I thought she would deny it all, tell me I was imagining things. But instead she sighed, placing her fork down carefully on the plate as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I've known for a while," she said quietly, "but I couldn't tell you. You had to figure it out yourself." I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. "What do you mean? Figure out what?" Emma's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something. Guilt, regret, maybe both. The The loop wasn't just about saving you, Lucas. It was about you saving yourself. Her words were cryptic, but they resonated with an unsettling truth. I tried to piece together what she was saying, but it felt like there were too many missing pieces to the puzzle. But why? I pressed, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Why couldn't you just tell me? Why did I have to relive those days again and again until I nearly lost my mind? Emma sighed, her gaze falling to her hands. Because some things can't be told. They have to be understood. You had to confront your own choices, your own fears, and you had to accept the consequences of those choices. Ethan, he wasn't just offering you his heart. He was offering you a second chance. But you couldn't accept it until you truly understood the weight of what that meant. I sat back, stunned. A second chance. My heart, Ethan's heart, was inside me now, keeping me alive. But what had it cost? Ethan died because of me, I whispered, the guilt gnawing at me. Emma shook her head. No, Lucas, Ethan died for you. There's a difference. The words stung, but there was truth in them. Ethan had made his choice, just as I had made mine. And in the end, it was about survival, not just of the body, but of the soul. For the first time since the loop had begun, I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm inside me had calmed, but it wasn't over. There was still something missing, something I needed to understand. But why did it stop now? I asked, still not fully grasping the final piece. Why did the loop break this time? Emma's face softened, and she reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. Because this time, you accepted what needed to be done. You didn't fight it. You accepted the heart, the sacrifice, and the truth. That's what broke the loop. I stared at her, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. The truth. But what was the full truth? Something still didn't add up. Emma, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. How did you know? How did you know the loop would end once I accepted everything? Her hand tightened around mine, her eyes glistening with something I couldn't quite place. I remembered, Lucas. Every time the loop reset, I remembered everything. My breath caught in my throat. You remembered? Every time? She nodded slowly. It wasn't just you who was trapped, Lucas. I was trapped with you. Every time you forgot, I remembered. Every dinner, every conversation, every desperate attempt you made to change things. I remembered it all. But I couldn't interfere. I could only watch you go through it, over and over, hoping that one day you'd figure it out. I sat there, stunned, the weight of her confession sinking in. Emma had been living in the loop too, but unlike me, she had been aware of it the entire time. The thought of her silently enduring the repetition, day after day, was almost too much to bear. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me you were going through it too? Her lips pressed together into a tight line. Because I knew you wouldn't believe me, and even if you did, it wouldn't have changed anything. You had to come to the realization on your own. The loop was tied to you, Lucas, not to me. I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around the enormity of what she was saying. So you just watched? Every single time? Every single time, she echoed, her voice tinged with sadness. I watched you suffer, and I watched you grow. But I couldn't interfere, because if I did, it would have just delayed the inevitable. I was at a loss for words. The pain of reliving those same days over and over again had nearly driven me insane. But knowing that Emma had been there with me, remembering every detail, feeling every loss, made it all the more unbearable. So, it's over now? I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Emma nodded. Yes, it's over. But her eyes held a shadow of doubt, as if she wasn't entirely sure. I stood up from the table, pacing the room, trying to process everything. The loop had ended, but it felt like the real mystery was just beginning. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Emma, I said, turning to face her. How did you really know it would end this way? Did someone tell you? Did you do something to make it stop? Rhea was one of the few brave souls who preferred the quiet of the night. She'd worked the shift for months, her desk a familiar refuge amidst the glow of screens and the distant echoes of colleagues on the other side of the room. But lately, an unsettling chill had begun to seep into her routine. It started subtly, an odd flicker of the fluorescent lights above, a fleeting shadow at the edge of her vision that vanished when she turned her head. One evening, as Ria adjusted her headset and prepared for another round of calls, she noticed a cold spot near her desk, a sharp contrast to the warm, buzzing air around her. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where the normal rules of the office were suspended. The sensation sent a shiver down her spine, but she brushed it off, convincing herself it was just the late hour playing tricks on her. As the clock ticked past midnight, her phone rang, the screen displaying an unknown number. She answered, and the line crackled with static, a ghostly echo that seemed to ripple through the silence of the call center. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Ria asked, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just the sound of her own breath mixed with the unsettling static. She hung up, her heart racing. The calls continued night after night, each one more eerie than the last. She'd hear whispers that sent a chill through her bones, words she couldn't quite decipher, fading in and out like the static on the line. One night, as she sat with her headphones on, she caught sight of a shadow moving along the wall, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. Ria blinked hard, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, a seed of dread began to sprout. As the nights rolled on, the cold spots multiplied, creeping closer to her desk, while the whispers morphed into haunting wails that echoed in her mind. She began to piece together fragments of an old legend, a tale whispered among the locals about spirits that haunted places of business after dark. They were said to be the restless souls of employees who had met untimely ends, trapped in a loop of unfulfilled work and sorrow. Desperate to find answers, Ria dug deeper into the stories that circulated among her colleagues. One evening, she cornered an older employee who had worked there long enough to know the whispers. "They say if you hear the calls, it's a warning," he told her, his voice low and trembling. "The spirits want something. They don't like being disturbed." Ria's heart raced. It was not just her imagination. She was being drawn into something far more sinister than she had anticipated. That night, she resolved to confront the presence that haunted her. As the clock struck 3, she gathered her courage and sat in silence, the hum of the call center replaced by an oppressive stillness. The phone rang again, the familiar unknown number flashing on the screen. She answered, ready to face whatever awaited her on the other end. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the hollow darkness. The static faded, and for a moment there was silence. Then a voice emerged, chilling and distant. "Help us." The words sent her spiraling. Suddenly, the cold spots surged around her, the shadows morphing into shapes that loomed larger and closer. Ria realized with a gut-wrenching twist that she was not merely hearing the calls, she was being summoned. The spirits were reaching out, desperate for release. With newfound resolve, Ria began to speak, her voice strong against the static. "I will help you, I promise." As she spoke, the shadows began to retreat, their forms dissolving into the dim light of the call center. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight lifted. The calls stopped that night, but the legend of the restless spirits remained etched in her mind. From that day on, Ria approached her night shifts with a mixture of caution and respect. She understood now that the call center was not just a workplace, it was a crossroads between the living and the departed. And as she sat at her desk, she could still feel the faint whispers lingering in the air, a reminder of the shadows that danced just out of sight, waiting for someone to hear their story. Days turned into weeks, and the call center continued its relentless rhythm, the cacophony of ringing phones and chatter, a constant backdrop to Ria's life. Yet, despite the calm that had settled after her encounter with the spirits, an unsettling feeling lingered. She could still sense the presence of those restless souls, a weight that hovered in the corners of her mind. As she worked her shifts, Ria began to notice subtle changes around her. Fellow employees who once laughed and joked in the break room now spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at their phones whenever the static-laden calls came through. It was as if everyone could feel the undercurrent of something supernatural, a shared unease that created a tight-knit web of fear. One evening, during a particularly quiet stretch, Ria received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line simply read, "Help." Curiosity piqued. She opened it, revealing a string of unsettling images. Photos of her desk taken at odd angles, shadows creeping into the frame. and faint silhouettes lurking in the background. The final image froze her blood, a close-up of her chair, empty, with a shadow draped over it, darker than the surrounding night. Heart racing, Rhea glanced around her workspace, the faint glow of her monitor illuminating her surroundings. The air felt thicker, more oppressive. She quickly checked the call logs, and her heart sank. She had received multiple calls from that same unknown number, all during the times she had been in the office alone. That night, emboldened by the knowledge she had gained, Rhea decided to confront the spirits again. She knew they were trying to communicate something important. She set up her desk in a way that invited the unknown. A small offering of flowers from the nearby market, a cup of water, and a candle that flickered in the dim light. As the hour grew late, she waited, heart pounding, her eyes scanning the darkness around her. The familiar ring broke the stillness, and she answered, her voice steady. "I'm here. What do you need from me?" The line crackled, and a voice, weak and trembling, emerged. "Release us." Rhea felt her throat constrict as she listened. "How?" she asked, desperation coloring her voice. "What do you want me to do?" A pause hung in the air, and she felt the temperature drop sharply. "Find the place." With each word, she felt the shadows deepen around her. Rhea understood then that she had to investigate further, to dig into the history of the call center. The spirits were tied to something, perhaps an event long forgotten that had left a scar on this place. The following days were a whirlwind of research. She delved into archives, interviewed old employees, and even visited local historians. Piece by piece, she uncovered a dark history of the building, a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of several workers during its construction decades ago. They had been trapped, a series of mistakes and miscommunication leading to a terrible collapse. Their cries for help swallowed by the dust of the past. Armed with this knowledge, Rhea returned to the call center one fateful night, determined to honor the spirits. She gathered her co-workers, sharing the story and inviting them to participate in a small ritual of remembrance. Together, they lit candles and shared their own experiences, allowing the spirit stories to surface, their voices weaving through the air. As they stood together, Rhea felt the atmosphere shift. The cold spots began to dissipate, and for the first time, she sensed a warmth enveloping the room. The oppressive weight that had hung over them lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Then, as the candles flickered, the lights overhead dimmed, and a gentle breeze swept through the room, carrying whispers of gratitude. "Thank you," the voice echoed, sounding clearer than ever. The energy in the space transformed, resonating with a softness that wrapped around them like a protective blanket. The unknown calls ceased that night, and the oppressive shadows melted away. Rhea realized that the spirits had found their voice, and in honoring their memory, she had helped them find release. From that day forward, the call center became a place not just of work, but of remembrance. Rhea and her colleagues continued to hold small gatherings, celebrating the lives of those lost and sharing stories, ensuring the spirits would never be forgotten again. And as Rhea walked through the halls, she felt a sense of calm, knowing that the shadows no longer lurked to haunt, but rather to watch over. A gentle reminder of the fragility of life and the power of connection, even in the darkest of places. With the shadows now a distant memory, the call center felt transformed. Employees chatted more freely, laughter echoed through the halls, and the atmosphere grew lighter. Rhea, though still haunted by the past, found solace in the rituals they had established. Every week, they set aside time to remember those who had come before, lighting candles and sharing stories, creating a tapestry of life that honored the lost. But as weeks turned into months, Rhea noticed an odd phenomenon. Although the restless energy had dissipated, strange occurrences began to surface. Objects moving slightly out of place, whispers of laughter echoing where no one stood, and the flickering lights that occasionally buzzed to life with no apparent cause. At first, it was dismissed as mere coincidence, but Rhea couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. One particularly quiet night, as Rhea worked late, she felt an urge to investigate further. The call center was empty except for her, and the silence felt oppressive. She decided to explore the basement, a rarely visited area rumored to hold remnants of the building's past. Armed with only a flashlight, she descended the narrow staircase, the air growing cooler with each step. The basement was dimly lit, with boxes stacked high and dust swirling in the beam of her flashlight. As she moved deeper into the space, a sense of déjà vu washed over her. The shadows here felt different, almost playful, as if they recognized her presence. Rhea carefully stepped around boxes, her breath echoing softly. In the far corner, she stumbled upon an old filing cabinet, half open, papers spilling out like forgotten memories. As she sifted through the documents, one caught her eye, a faded photograph of the construction crew from decades ago. Faces stared back at her, some smiling, others serious, but all vibrant with life. Her heart raced as she spotted a familiar face, a young man who resembled the whispers she had heard on the phone. Suddenly, the air shifted. A cold breeze swept through the basement, rustling the papers around her. Rhea froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The flashlight flickered, and she felt an overwhelming presence surround her, a chorus of voices rising and falling in the silence. "Help us. Remember," they seemed to plead. Rhea took a deep breath, grounding herself. "I'm here," she whispered, feeling a connection to them, a thread woven through time. "What do you want me to do?" The shadows shifted again, and in that moment, Rhea understood. It wasn't enough to simply remember them. They wanted their story told, to be acknowledged in a way that transcended the mundane. The call center was a business, but it could also be a monument, a place where their legacy lived on, not just in whispered tales, but in the hearts of those who worked there. Determined, Rhea returned to her desk and drafted a proposal. She envisioned a memorial wall in the break room, adorned with the faces of the lost, accompanied by stories and memories shared by employees. It would serve as a constant reminder of their presence, celebrating the lives that once filled the building with laughter and camaraderie. As she shared her idea with her colleagues, a wave of enthusiasm swept through the team. They collaborated, collecting stories and photographs, engaging in conversations that sparked laughter and tears. The project grew, transforming into a community effort that brought them all closer together, reinforcing their bond and honoring the past. When the memorial wall was finally unveiled, Rhea stood before it, heart swelling with pride. The space was filled with love, warmth, and a sense of belonging. Each photograph and story resonated, allowing the spirits to reclaim their voices. That night, as Rhea locked up the call center, she felt a familiar presence, but this time it was gentle, reassuring. The air was lighter, filled with a sense of gratitude. She glanced back at the memorial wall, where the candle she had lit flickered softly, illuminating the names and faces that now belonged to everyone in the building. From then on, Rhea no longer felt the chill of shadows or the weight of sorrow. Instead, she carried with her the stories of those who had come before, a connection that bridged the past and the present. And in the quiet moments, when the night shift felt long and lonely, she would whisper her thanks to the spirits who had taught her the true meaning of remembrance, love, and the enduring power of connection in even the darkest places.